Between 1792 and 1800, over 400 enslaved men, women, and children built what would become the most recognizable building in America. Their names were deliberately erased from official records, and their bodies buried in unmarked graves across the District of Columbia. The government maintained these omissions were policy, not accidental. But in 1901, a restoration crew discovered something beneath the East Wing's foundation that made the superintendent immediately halt all excavation. The discovery was reburied, and the workers were sworn to silence. What they found suggested the original construction involved more than simple labor exploitation. It pointed to the systematic concealment of deaths that occurred under circumstances the young republic could never afford to acknowledge. Tonight, you'll hear what those records actually contained. Before we continue with the story of how America's greatest symbol was built on suffering deliberately hidden from history, I want to ask you something. If you're listening from Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere in the United States, leave a comment telling us where you're from. Now subscribe to The Forgotten Liturgy so you never miss the dark chapters of American history they tried to bury. Let's uncover the truth together. The discovery in 1901 wouldn't be the last time evidence surfaced. To understand its danger, you must know how the project began. In 1791, President Washington selected a malarial swampland for the new federal district. The commissioners immediately faced a problem. The federal government had no money for the ambitious $400,000 project. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson proposed the solution: hire enslaved workers. Their masters would receive a rental fee, typically $5 per month per person, while the workers themselves received nothing beyond basic food and shelter. The chief architect, James Hoban, submitted plans in 1792, but Washington insisted on expanding the building by 1/5, drastically increasing the need for labor. By November 1792, approximately 150 enslaved workers had been assembled from plantations across Maryland and Virginia. Their masters' names, Daniel Carroll, Notley Young, etc., appear in the ledgers, but the workers themselves were often listed only by first name or simply as Negro Man or Negro Boy, followed by an age estimate. The work began immediately, involving clearing the site, draining swampland, and excavating the foundation, often working waist-deep in freezing mud. The pressure from President Washington to complete the house before his term ended in 1797 translated into grueling schedules. References mention 16-hour days, 7 days a week, during good weather. Living conditions were harsh. The workers were housed in crude barracks with only straw for bedding. Skilled craftsmen were essential. Isaac, a carpenter, worked throughout 1793 and 1794, but his name suddenly disappears from the ledgers after November 1794, with no note of his return or sale. Similarly, Peter Lennox, a quarryman supervising dangerous stone cutting in Virginia, is noted as reliable and skilled through 1796, before he too vanishes from documentation. The commissioner's promise to return the workers unharmed proved worthless, and these vanished names hint at a reality the records were designed to hide. The enslaved workers received only the cheapest possible provisions: no meat, no vegetables, just enough to keep them working. Disease was inevitable in the malarial swampland. A June 1793 note complained that the flux, dysentery, has taken hold, reducing the workforce by nearly a third, with no mention of treatment, only the delay caused. Medical care was minimal at best. Physician William Thornton billed far less for treating enslaved people despite their greater numbers. The common practice was to send the too ill back to their masters, hiring a replacement and leaving no paper trail of their fate. The Scottish stonemason Colin Williamson provided a rare human perspective in his surviving diary. In July 1794, he recorded a scaffold collapse where 3 men fell, 2 of them enslaved. The white man was immediately attended to, but the 2 enslaved men were left for nearly an hour. Williamson noted one had a broken back and lamented, "I'm told this is not my concern." Official ledgers show the name of one worker, Ben, disappearing and immediately being replaced by Negro Man Jim, a pattern of sudden, unexplained substitutions that suggests workers were dying or being incapacitated and swiftly replaced. By 1795, the project grew, and references to the enslaved workforce became intentionally vague in official documents, shifting from Negro carpenters to sanitized terms like contracted labor or servants. This linguistic shift was deliberate. The commissioners understood the optics were problematic for a symbol of the new republic to be built by people without freedom. George Washington, despite multiple site visits, never once mentioned the enslaved workers in his diary entries, an omission that speaks volumes. The project had two classes of labor. White immigrant laborers were paid wages, had surnames in the records, and received medical care and compensation when injured. The enslaved workers had none of these rights, no choice, no voice, and their children would inherit their chains. They built the house knowing their names would be forgotten. But some of them left marks anyway. In the spring of 1796, Chief Architect James Hoban reported finding strange, shallow markings on stone blocks being set into the north wall. The commissioners dismissed them as meaningless scratches and instructed Hoban to turn the stones inward and continue construction. The markings were not meaningless. They were names, initials, or full names like Isaac, carved subtly by enslaved stonecutters, acts of extraordinary courage that, if discovered during the carving, would have resulted in severe punishment. These men, whose official record was Negro Man, ensured their presence became a permanent hidden part of the president's house. These marked stones were discovered again in 1902 during Theodore Roosevelt's renovation, hidden behind plaster, exactly as Hoban had placed them. The renovation supervisor noted the discovery in his private records, understanding the significance, but no official report was ever filed. The marked stones, however, were only a small part of what had been deliberately concealed. The more significant concealment began in the summer of 1797 during a catastrophic heat wave. The combination of extreme heat, swampland humidity, and inadequate water caused dozens of enslaved laborers to fall ill with summer fevers. The commissioners sent urgent letters, at least 23 surviving, requesting immediate replacement workers, but contained no follow-up on the sick workers' fate. Colin Williamson's diary is harrowing. On July 23, 1797, he noted the sickness spreading like wildfire with no physician attending. He learned the sick were moved to a hastily constructed shed near the old kiln site. He visited on July 28, finding at least 20 men clearly dying, with only a young enslaved girl, unmentioned in official records, tending them with water and rags. The overseer told him construction could not be halted for illness, and that his job was stonework, not nursing. On August 5th, Williamson found the shed simply empty, noting he saw no wagons or walking men leaving, and was told they had recovered, a claim he deeply suspected. If the workers had recovered and returned, documentation would exist. Instead, there is silence, a void in the records. Only when plantation owners like William Brent demanded answers about 5 missing workers did the commissioners admit the truth in November 1797. Death occurred despite best efforts at treatment. The letter treated their deaths as an unfortunate but unremarkable business matter, stopping payment but providing no details, compensation, or burial information. This admission suggests deaths were being deliberately obscured. Architectural historian Benjamin Latrobe Jr. later estimated in 1882 that between 30 and 50 enslaved persons likely perished, based on gaps in payment ledgers and name substitutions. Given the harsh conditions and the era's typical mortality rates, 10–15% on large projects, the death toll could have been as high as 40 to 75 people. This question of where they were buried led directly to the 1901 discovery beneath the East Wing's foundation. Workers digging 6 feet below ground level found human bones, at least a dozen skulls, according to the superintendent's private notes, along with other bones buried hastily and without ceremony. There were no coffins, no markers, just bones in the dirt beneath the building's foundation. The workers were immediately sworn to secrecy, and the discovery was reburied, confirming that the very foundation of the president's house was built over the unacknowledged dead. The discovery of human bones beneath the East Wing's foundation in 1901 was immediately recognized by Superintendent Henry Reed as a potential massive public scandal. Reed made a swift decision: rebury the bones, swear the work crew to silence, and move the renovation to a different area. Reed's private diary, discovered in 1978, detailed the find: at least 12 skulls, some showing signs of trauma, buried without attempt at proper burial. An old worker, Joseph, shared stories from his grandfather about these workers, calling them the forgotten ones. Reed never filed an official report, choosing instead to take the secret to his grave, ensuring the evidence was concealed for a second time. The bones raised terrible, unanswered questions. Did these enslaved workers die during construction and were simply disposed of? Did the skull damage point to accidents, the toll of brutal labor, or something worse? Without forensic examination, the truth was forever buried. The president's house was completed in November 1800, and the commissioner's final report was a masterpiece of omission, detailing every aspect except the fact that the majority of the craftsmen were enslaved people who received no payment, no recognition, and often no burial. The building's history was replaced with a mythology, and official narratives sanitized the workforce with euphemisms like servants or contracted labor. This pattern of selective memory continued throughout the 19th century, but the truth survived in the oral tradition of the enslaved community. The story of the heat, the sickness, the friends who disappeared, and the bones buried on the grounds was passed down through generations. In 1978, one such story was discovered, a handwritten narrative by Celia Robertson, born 1819, recounting the experiences of her grandfather, Thomas, who worked on the construction. Thomas's account was far darker than any official history. He said overseers saw them as tools like the hammers and saws. When a tool broke, you got another. He described burying friends in the night and the heartbreaking story of his friend Peter, whose name disappears from ledgers, who carved his name into a stone, saying, "They'll forget us, but the stone will remember long after we're gone." Thomas had nightmares for the rest of his life, hearing the sounds of men dying in the isolated shed. He confirmed the scaffold collapse incident, where 2 injured enslaved men lay broken for nearly an hour before being carried away, never to be seen again. Robertson's document, published in an obscure academic journal in 1982, offered one of the only first-hand accounts that proved the White House's elegant facade was built on a deliberate foundation of unacknowledged death and suffering. Despite its profound nature, Celia Robertson's account received little attention, as it contradicted the established, comfortable narrative of the White House's origins. However, the document provided crucial corroboration. Thomas's memory of the isolated shed and the scaffolding incident matched the contemporary diary entries of Colin Williamson almost perfectly. This convergence proved that the significant loss of enslaved lives during construction was not just an unfortunate event, but a history that was systematically erased. Physical evidence supported this conclusion. In 1978, ground-penetrating radar analysis of the White House grounds revealed anomalies consistent with unmarked graves in at least 3 locations. Near the 1901 bone discovery site near the old kiln, where Williamson saw the sick shed, and an area now part of the Rose Garden. The archaeologists noted these findings but recommended against excavation, citing the political sensitivity of finding unrecorded remains of enslaved individuals. This decision, like Henry Reed's in 1901, prioritized institutional reputation over historical truth. Benjamin Latrobe Jr. became obsessed with the true death toll. After reviewing records, he collected oral histories from 17 elderly African Americans whose ancestors worked on the project. Their consistent stories, brutal conditions, sickness, and people vanishing, especially during the deadly summer of 1797, confirmed his research. Latrobe compiled these accounts into a manuscript titled The Hidden Cost, but no publisher would touch it for 5 years, deeming it too controversial and damaging to the reputation of venerable institutions. His work was finally published in 1934 in a tiny edition of 500 copies that quickly vanished, showing that even when the truth was documented, the established mythology was too powerful to overcome. The official narrative, that the White House was a symbol of democratic ideals, was protected at all costs. Acknowledging that it was built on the backs of enslaved people who died unmarked would require confronting truths about the nation's founding that most Americans were not ready to face. Thus, the truth remained buried, literally and figuratively, beneath centuries of silence. Celia Robertson's grandfather, Thomas, suffered nightmares until his death, haunted by the sound of men dying in the isolated shed, a sound that stopped after a few days. And then the shed was empty. He cemented the fact that the White House's construction was founded on unacknowledged, suppressed death. If you're finding this story as disturbing as it truly is, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment with your thoughts. What do you think happened to those men in that shed? And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because stories like this need to be told and remembered. The official mythology was constantly threatened by physical evidence that was quickly reburied. In 1867, workers repairing the foundation found a small wooden disc carved with the initials PL and the date 1796, likely left by the vanished quarryman Peter Lennox. The White House steward noted it as a curious article and shelved it, conducting no further investigation. That same year, the steward privately noted the discovery of human remains near the eastern wall, choosing to rebury the bones and remain silent, believing it would cause unnecessary scandal. In 1891, historian Herbert Braftoft was given access to forgotten archives. He found damning evidence, including plantation owner Samuel Davidson's unsent letter from 1797, accusing the commissioners of barbaric conditions and negligence. The true toll of this construction is far higher than anyone will admit. Based on documentation and Davidson's letter, Braftoft estimated a minimum of 40 deaths. Braftoft compiled his findings into a manuscript section titled "The Human Cost of Construction," writing honestly that the deaths were deliberately obscured and the compensation was nothing. The Interior Department's response was an unambiguous order: remove this section entirely, or the book would not be published. Braftoft protested, but faced with losing 2 years of work and payment, he complied. He published the sanitized history but kept the deleted damning pages, writing a note on the folder: the truth about how the president's house was built. Removed from my history at government insistence. May someone braver than I eventually tell this story. The published history contained just one innocuous paragraph about the labor. Both Braftoft's suppressed document and Benjamin Latrobe Jr.'s earlier unpublished manuscript, The Hidden Cost, with its estimate of 30 to 50 deaths based on oral history and record gaps, served as proof that the truth was systematically documented, only to be systematically buried, a historical cover-up spanning over a century. Despite 5 years of trying, Benjamin Latrobe Jr. failed to publish his manuscript, The Hidden Cost, because publishers universally deemed it too controversial and worried it would damage the reputation of venerable institutions. The mythology of the White House was too central to the national identity. The truth about the enslaved dead was too uncomfortable for late 19th century America to face. In October 1901, these buried truths rushed back when Superintendent Henry Reed's crew dug beneath the East Wing foundation. They uncovered at least a dozen skulls, possibly more, along with numerous other human bones, buried hastily and without ceremony, just discarded in the dirt beneath the building. Reed, recognizing the scandal, made an immediate decision: rebury everything, swear the crew to silence, and move the work to the west side. An older enslaved laborer named Joseph, whose grandfather had worked on the original construction, told Reed the local stories. There were men buried near the house, workers who died. He called them the forgotten ones. Joseph pleaded, those men deserve better than being buried twice with no one knowing. The following spring, in March 1902, during interior renovations, workmen removing old plaster discovered stones that had been turned inward exactly as Hoban had instructed in 1796. The shallow scratches were deliberate names and initials: P.L., Peter Lennox, T., Thomas, and Isaac. The supervisor immediately ordered the workers to replace the plaster and keep silent. However, a young worker named Timothy O'Brien secretly made a sketch, writing in his diary, "Seems wrong, leaving those names hidden, but I suppose that's how it's always been." The carved names, now rediscovered, were covered once more, and President Theodore Roosevelt was never told about the bones or the names. The pattern was clear: the dead would stay buried, the names would stay hidden, and the comfortable mythology would remain undisturbed. By the summer of 1902, all renovation work was complete. The White House stood magnificent, reinforced, and refreshed. Tour guides spoke of the architecture and presidents, but no one mentioned the bones buried on the grounds or the names hidden in the walls. No one acknowledged the price paid to build this symbol of American democracy. In plantation communities, elderly people still told stories of grandparents who worked on the president's house and never came home. But by 1902, most of these storytellers had died. Their children remembered the stories, but the details blurred. Meanwhile, the scattered truth was invisible. Celia Robertson's writings remained hidden. Herbert Braftoft's deleted manuscript section sat in a box. Latrobe's book gathered dust, and Henry Reed's diary sat unread. Without someone to gather the pieces and force the uncomfortable questions, the truth ceased to exist for the public. The White House stood gleaming, built on foundations laid by people whose names were erased, their labor uncompensated, and their deaths unacknowledged. The questions that should have been asked in 1797 were never asked. The investigations that should have happened never occurred. The carved names stayed hidden behind plaster. The bones stayed buried in the earth. And the comfortable myth remained undisturbed. In Washington's African-American neighborhoods, some still knew different. My people built that, old folks would say, built it with their own hands, and got nothing for it. Some of them died building it and got buried right there on the grounds. Yet their descendants often struggled to believe them, thinking such a significant truth would surely be in the history books. This is how truth dies, not in one dramatic suppression, but in 1,000 small decisions to look away. Braftoft removing his section to get paid. Reed reburying the bones to avoid scandal. Supervisors covering carved names. Each person who chose silence had understandable reasons, but the accumulation of those reasonable decisions meant that the people who built the White House with their own hands were forgotten anyway. The White House still stands on those foundations. The comfortable mythology persisted because the truth had been buried too many times, too deeply. This story shows us how historical truth can be methodically erased, how institutional silence is more powerful than active censorship, and how people can build the most famous symbols while remaining utterly invisible themselves. The cost of maintaining comfortable myths is often paid by those who have no voice to demand remembrance. What do you think happened to all those workers whose names disappeared from the records? How many do you think really died? Leave your comment below with your theories. If you found this story as haunting as it truly is, subscribe to The Forgotten Liturgy, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear these forgotten stories.